Thank you so much for being here. My name is Debbie O'Malley, and I'm Associate Director of the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government. At the CCCG, we seek to cultivate thoughtful citizenship through supporting scholarship and events, education, fellowships on the principles of constitutional government. So to that end, we bring in distinguished guests, such as our speaker today, and we also offer specific courses and fellowships for students. So before we get started with the event, I'm just going to mention a few upcoming opportunities that we have for this spring. So our last lecture of the semester will be in this room on April 26th at 12:30 p.m. Lunch will be provided at noon as usual. And we will be bringing Professor Harvey Mansfield from Harvard University. If you've read Alexis de Tocqueville, you may recognize his name as one of the translators of a commonly used edition of Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And he will be speaking on how to read Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Again, that's April 26th. Professor Mansfield has been at Harvard for 74 years, 61 of which he has been on the faculty. He's one of the nation's most leading political scientists, and we're excited to be hosting him. In terms of a few opportunities for students that are coming up, I want to mention two different courses. I know that registration is starting soon. For the second year in a row, we're actually going to offer the sequence of two courses, one in the fall, one in the spring, on the core texts in citizenship and constitutional government. This upcoming year, that two-semester sequence will be taught by Professor Collins and Professor Keyes, one teaching ancients and one teaching moderns. So that's going to be open to con studies and political science students. We're also excited to offer a one-credit course on race and American constitutionalism. That will be co-taught by Professor Munoz and Federal Judge Amul Thapar. For that one, if you're interested in taking this one-credit course, please email Soren Greffenstedt. You can find her email address on our website. And then lastly, I wanted to mention that applications for the fall 2023 Tocqueville Fellowship are now open. So this is a fellowship for students at Notre Dame, St. Mary's, and Holy Cross. You could be of any major or program. And it's for students who wish to discuss and participate in an intellectual community, discussing politics, culture, and philosophy. You get sort of private meals with our speakers that we bring in, and some other opportunities. So again, you can be a part of any major. The application is found on our website, constudies.nd.edu, and it is due May 19th. So there's quite a few opportunities coming up in the last few weeks of the semester. I'm going to introduce, we have a tradition of inviting our students to introduce our distinguished guests. And so I'm happy to introduce Madeline Kasabuki. She is a junior from Libertyville, Illinois, and she is studying math and constitutional studies. She is one of this semester's Tocqueville Fellows. So Madeline, thank you so much.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. Carl L. Trueman is a professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College. He received his doctorate from the University of Aberdeen. Professor Trueman is also a contributing editor at First Things, an esteemed church historian, and a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He has authored or edited more than a dozen books, including The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and The Road to the Sexual Revolution. His most recent book, and the topic of the lecture today, is Strange New World: How Thinkers and Activists Redefined Identity and Sparked the Sexual Revolution. Please join me in welcoming Professor Trueman.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be speaking to you all today. Known about Notre Dame for a long time. In fact, Professor Murphy, is Professor Murphy here? problem. No, Professor Murphy was a colleague from theology, was a colleague of mine at the University of Aberdeen 25 years ago. And I remember when she came to Notre Dame, she said to me, well, I'll invite you to give a lecture. And she never did. And when I saw her next time, I remember some of you who know her will find this entirely believable. I'm sure she said, I was going to invite you, but then when I got to Notre Dame, I realized that Protestants are weird. And so the invitation never came through. So it's great the wrong has finally been righted. I'm delighted to be here. And first of all, let me thank Philip Munoz both for his friendship and for the invitation to come and speak, and to Debbie O'Malley and her team for the smooth running of my arrival and everything. It's been a lovely day, and I already met with two groups of students, and I want to, any of those students who are present here, thoroughly enjoyed our time together. I always enjoy a time of Q&A when the questions make me think and make me realize that I probably need to go back and refine some of my thoughts. And that was very much my experience today. Very good questions that I'm going to have to go back and wrestle with some of the things that came up in those sessions we had. My topic today is to speak on Strange New World. I mentioned in one of the student sessions that I have the attention span of a squirrel, or I think squirrel is how you would pronounce it in America, which means that when I've done something, I tend to move on. I get interested in a lot of things. My background is in Reformation studies. I did my PhD in the 16th century, did my postdoctoral work in the 17th century, and now I'm speaking on themes that really touch on issues that are very much of importance to the modern world. So I tend to move on. And so I'm not going to lecture. I'm not going to do a rehash of the book in this lecture. What I want to do is look at one of the things I missed in the book. I think there is a gaping hole, at least in the first book. I gesture towards it in the second book. I want to think about it in more detail lunchtime. And I think it also causes me to reframe one of the areas that I look at in both books. And the area I want to reframe towards the end of this lecture is my discussion of the transgender moment in the West, specifically in American society. So that's what I want to do today. I'm not going to rehash what I've done before. Please buy the book, boosts my royalties. Very happy for you to do that. What I'm going to do is give you something a little different. I want to talk about what I think is the underlying problem of both books. So my wife hates me doing that. I think it's the result of becoming bald. I can't believe that my hair is gone, and when I lecture, my hand goes up to confirm the fact. Underlying both books, I think, is the question of anthropology. What does it mean to be a human being? It is 80 years ago this year that C.S. Lewis gave the brief lectures that became his little classic, The Abolition of Man. If you haven't read it recently, I would certainly recommend that you look at the third lecture entitled The Abolition of Man. I would put it alongside Philip Reef's 1966 book, The Triumph of the Therapeutic, as one of those texts that is more prophetic than the author could possibly have known at the time he was writing. That's what makes it very, very remarkable. We live in an era where I think anthropology is the issue. I'm a Reformation guy. If you go back to the Reformation, what are the issues of the Reformation? I think sacraments and salvation and authority. Today, that's not the issue. That's not the issue pressing on us. I think it's the issue of anthropology. What does it mean to be human? There are various symptoms of this question, of this problem around. There's been much amusement on the right and much consternation on the left over the last couple of years over the number of very intelligent people who've floundered when asked the simple question, what is a woman? I interviewed Professor Vivale about a month ago on my podcast, and I started by asking her, what is a woman? And I'm delighted to report that she gave me a 2-minute definition. Never took a breath, gave me a very, very clear definition. But she's exceptional. She's an exception today. That's not typical for one reason or another. And I think the question about what it means to be a woman, the problems that underlie answering that question connect to anthropology. It's a symptom, I think, of a deeper question. What does it mean to be human? The thing about lectures such as this is, whenever you prepare them, they're almost always out of date if you deliver them today, more than 48 hours after you prepared them. I prepared the bones of this lecture some 2 or 3 months ago. I'd never even heard of ChatGPT at that particular point in time. But the whole issue of artificial intelligence has come pressing in on us in a way that perhaps none of us quite anticipated would happen so quickly. I'm somewhat skeptical of the apocalyptic scenarios being presented around artificial intelligence, but nonetheless, AI raises serious questions about what it means to be human. At a more intuitive level, I think the kind of questions that were raised about lockdown also pose challenges to what does it mean to be a human? To what extent is it important to be able to see somebody else's face or to have some kind of physical contact with them? I'm English, not a big hugger. There were 2 things I really liked about lockdown. One, faculty meetings were online, which meant that I could just switch off my camera and do some constructive work while they were going on. And the second thing was, nobody tried to hug me. I was living the dream for about 2 years there. Hugging has made an unfortunate comeback, I think, in American culture. And the rise of social media. Think about social media. I was talking to the students this morning about the issue of, self-confidence, self-assurance. When I was at school, I had 5 or 6 friends. I saw them every day. Falling out was costly. Insulting a friend was costly. Knowing how they thought about you was relatively straightforward. That no longer applies when you have a very, very vast and unstable collection of friends in the virtual world. Raises questions, I think, about what does it mean to be human. And that's what I want to look at today. I really neglect that in the books, but it's something that I've been thinking about an awful lot since. Before I move into the meat, though, of the sort of the lecture, I want to make a distinction. Philosophers here may say, well, this is a bit of a naive distinction, or we would pose it another way. But I want to make a distinction between what I call the what of being human and the who of being human. The human condition strikes me as unique. The distinction between what we are and who we are can be very dramatic, such that if any of you are chatting to me after the lecture and I ask you about yourself, you're not going to tell me your genome. You're going to tell me about the things that make you distinctive to who you are. The who is far more important than the what. That distinguishes us, as far as I can see it, from every other creature on the face of the planet. I can't believe that yesterday when I stopped for petrol, for gas in Ohio, it was 82 degrees. And when I arrived here, I think it was 42 degrees. You could almost watch the temperature falling as you traveled west. Well, Saturday was very warm in western Pennsylvania. I'm one of those guys, I put on weight in the winter because I can't do my chosen beloved form of exercise, which is cycle. I just got too soft as I got older. Saturday was beautifully warm and I got out for my first bike ride. About 4 miles into the ride, suddenly I hear a noise to my right and I look over and it's a deer. I could reach out and touch this thing, running, synchronized with me. And for 15 seconds or so, I'm racing this deer. But I'm acutely conscious in that situation that I need to hold my line, because any sudden movement is going to precipitate an instinctive reaction from the deer. So I am consciously holding my line. He is instinctively holding his line. There's a big difference there. By the way, I'd say that sort of experience, money can't buy that kind of experience. That's why it's so beautiful to live, I think, in the countryside. We have foxes at the bottom of our garden. Foxes. Well, if you put a fox in the presence of a chicken, I grew up, my parents kept ducks when I was growing up in the West Country of England. I've never seen a fox deal with a chicken, but I have seen a fox deal with a duck. You put a fox in the presence of a duck or a chicken, you've seen every fox in the presence of a duck or a chicken. I could give any one of you a duck or a chicken today. Maybe some of you would wring its neck. Maybe some of you would nurture it. Maybe some of you would release it into the wild. I cannot predict how you will respond in the presence of a chicken because you're a creature of intention. You're a creature for whom the who is in many ways more important than the what. And that brings me then to how I want to set up the question today. To set up the question, I want to cite a passage from the German, polymath, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Many, probably all of you are familiar with the Faust legend, the doctor who sells his soul to Mephistopheles. The greatest version of that story, of course, is Goethe's great prose drama, the composition of which took him many, many decades. I want to read for you from the scene where Mephistopheles first meets Faust in Goethe's Faust. Mephistopheles confronts Faust and he says this: "My dear sir, you are looking at things in a conventional way. We must do better than that, or the joys of life will escape us. Hang it, you have your hands and feet. You have a headpiece and a codpiece. And anything else you can enjoy is yours, isn't it? If I can afford a coach and six, isn't their energy mine? I can ride around proudly as if I had 24 legs." I think what Mephistopheles is presenting to Faust there is this. It's what I would call the technological temptation. Faust can transcend his humanity by the deployment of technology. That's critical. If I can buy a coach and six, I can ride around proudly as if I had 24 legs. And what I want to suggest in this lecture is that, the big gap, if you like, in my analyses in those two books is the role of technology. I've been wrestling with the question of how do these ideas, some of which seem to be self-evidently nonsensical, become intuitive within a culture? How does that take place? How are our intuitions shaped in such a way that crazy ideas come to grip the imagination? Reminds me of a passage I read it again relatively recently in an essay that the English Christian ethicist Oliver O'Donovan wrote, reflecting on his experiences in the pro-life movement. I think he's right. He wrote this essay in the 80s, and he's looking back at the 60s and 70s. And he made a comment that intrigued me. He said this. He said, one of the things that wrong-footed me, I'm paraphrasing, not quoting directly here. One of the things that wrong-footed me was this, that the weakest argument that the opposition had proved to be the strongest in the court of public opinion. The weakest argument, he said, was that the baby in the womb is just part of the woman's body. And he goes on to say, essentially, I regarded that argument as such self-evident nonsense, I never really bothered engaging with it at any great depth. And then he goes on to reflect upon why the weakest argument proved to be the strongest. And his conclusion is this: because the weakest argument appealed to the deeply ingrained emotional intuitions of the age. The idea of the individual as free, self-determining, free-floating, self-defining. The intuition that we are free, sovereign individual wills, tasked with self-creation, runs very, very deep. And I want to ask the question as to why that is the case. I was giving a version of this lecture a month or two ago at a college where a group of students had turned up to protest me. Professor Munoz was casting scorn on whether I'd truly been protested because they listened politely and left and protested me elsewhere on campus. But knowing they were going, I didn't originally, 2 days before, I'd spoken to the person who'd organized it. I said, "Celebrate, there isn't going to be a protest, is there?" He said, "Oh, no. When he picked me up from the airport the night before the talk, he said, got to bring you up to speed on something." I thought what I'd do is I would wrong foot the potential protesters. And I'd say, okay, first thing I'm going to look at is the most controversial piece of technology for shaping intuitions about freedom and independency. What is it? Music. Music. Something we never think about. But let's spend a few moments thinking about music. As far as I'm aware, I can't say every culture in the world has music because I am not familiar with every culture in the world. But of all the cultures of which I am aware, every single one has a place for music. The music may sound different in different cultures, but there is a place for music. And music seems traditionally to have been, well, certainly in its origins, seem to have marked key events in communal life. We still have that today, don't we? We'll sing at church services, for example. We celebrate weddings. Maybe we celebrate births with music. We have lamentations. Sometimes we will mark tragedies and deaths with particular forms of music. Parties are often infused with music. Communal experiences were shared and expressed in musical form. Although my title is Professor of Biblical and Religious Studies, that's a notional title to fit me in somewhere at Grove. I'm not a biblical scholar at all, but my background is very much in psalm singing Presbyterianism. The Psalms arise out of the communal life of Israel. They express key communal experiences, such as exile, for example, lamentation. The African American spiritual tradition would seem to me to play into this as well. A community giving expression to the depth of tragic communal experience, using words and music. Think of the rich traditions of ballads and folk songs that many cultures have. Certainly England has a strong tradition of folk music. I live, Western Pennsylvania doesn't think of it this way, but I live in, so I suppose, Upper Appalachia. Appalachian music is very interesting. Think about it. Music arose out of and reflected, was a constitutive part of communal life. And it was necessarily, up until relatively recently, a matter of communal production. 150 years ago, you want to enjoy music, what do you got to do? You've got to make it. Or you've got to go somewhere where it's being made. Music reminded you continually of the fact that you belong to a greater whole than yourself. One could make the same case about dancing. I'm not a big Jane Austen person. I joke that for me, for a 19th century novel to be great, some totally innocent person has got to die tragically towards the end. I'm more of a Bronte's guy than I am an Austen guy. One of the things I do, though, when I'm teaching Grove, is I'll show the picture of Mr. Darcy and one of the Miss Bennets dancing in that BBC production from maybe 30 years ago. And I make the point that if we erased everybody on that out of that picture except for, say, Mr. Darcy, and we just played his dance moves, he'd look ridiculous. Dancing was a communal thing. We move, of course, through the foxtrot and the waltz to a sort of narrowing where dance becomes more of a one-on-one thing, to now, and the final picture I show is John Travolta, Saturday Night Fever. That's an ancient movie for about half of you in this room, I'm sure. To me, it was like yesterday. I was horrified flying to Europe recently. I love they have that classic movie channel so I always click on the classic movie because I'm thinking, it's going to be a classic movie. I didn't realize that the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man franchise was as far back as it went. I remember taking my kids to see those movies. Not bad movies, by the way, but not classics. It's got to be black and white for it to be truly classic, I think. John Travolta, though, is just strutting his stuff. Just strutting his stuff. It's a purely individual thing. That's how we dance today. Has an analog with music. My wife gets upset that I don't dance at weddings, or she has to force me to dance at weddings. Obviously, dancing today has become purely a mating ritual. Once you found a mate, why do you need to dance anymore? I've been married 32 years. Anyway, music has become a matter of individual consumption, not communal production. Now, this is a work in progress for me, but my mind's thinking that has to be significant. If cultures created music in order to mark communal identity, communal interconnections, then the move with the advent, I suppose, originally of the phonograph, then the vinyl LP, and then the CD, and now, of course, Spotify, has to be significant. I love music. I try to get to a live concert each year. I'm very eclectic. Go to a classical concert. Huge fan of the Canadian rock band Rush. Got to their farewell tour. I suddenly realized that as I look around, 80% of the audience were middle-aged, bald guys. I'm an immigrant, and I look around and I thought, finally, in North America, I'm among my people. It was very, very strong at that point. But I love a live band. But that's not how most of us experience music most of the time. Most of the time, we use music to cut ourselves off from other people. When I got on a plane the other week, it's always a relief to me when the people sitting either side of me put their earbuds in. Means they're not going to engage me in conversation. I'm an antisocial sort of guy, and I can just get on with reading my book. But notice how music functions there. Music functions as that which isolates, not that which brings us together. That has to shape our intuition about what it means to be a human being. And without wanting to be trivial, think about Spotify. I joke that students don't even know what I'm talking about, but I would say there can never be another Pink Floyd. Progressive rock required you to listen to the whole album in order. Spotify now, not only do you listen by yourself, you are absolutely sovereign over the order you listen to and what you listen to. All of that has to shape our intuitions. So that's the first thing. Second sign, I think, that anthropology is shifting. Yeah, I hesitate to raise this at Notre Dame because I know Professor Sneed is a friend of mine, teaches here. I've learned more from him probably than anybody else about medical ethics. I'm just an amateur. I hesitate to comment on this field at his university, but just may make a couple of reflections on shifts in medical ethics. It seems to me that we are in an era where medical ethics have shifted from being primarily restorative to being transformative. What do I mean by that? Well, I would say an obvious example would be plastic surgery. Looking up the history of plastic surgery, it seems that most cultures have some form of plastic surgery. You go back to ancient Greece, you'll find primitive rhinoplasties. Goodness knows what it must have been like to have a rhinoplasty in ancient Greece. Absolutely horrific. My nose would have had to have been really bad, I think, for me to have opted for that. Plastic surgery really takes off in the modern world after the First World War. Takes off in Britain, with young men returning from the front. Young men whose bodies had been destroyed but not killed by the horrors of trench warfare. Plastic surgery was designed to try to restore some kind of human dignity to those bodies that had been so badly destroyed. It was restorative. It was restorative. It operated with a vision of what a human being was normatively to be. And it worked to try to bring this mutilated body back to that kind of norm. Plastic surgery today, I think, is by and large cosmetic. It's not so much about restoring dignity. Sure, there are cases where people are badly burned and we have skin grafts and things like that. But I think those advertisements in flight magazines for top plastic surgeons are not appealing to people who need skin grafts. They're appealing to people who want to transcend the natural limits and condition of their bodies. It's become cosmetic. Plastic surgery is connected to the realization of a vision that transcends the actual through aiming at some ideal construction of the individual human will. And it sells. That tells you something about the anthropology with which we operate, that is being enabled, reinforced, perhaps even produced in some way by surgical, technological, medical innovations. And you can just imagine how it's going to go in other areas, particularly gene editing. My wife and I were on holiday in Rome, actually, with a good friends of ours recently. He's a Presbyterian pastor down south, and he has a granddaughter who has Rett syndrome. don't know if you've ever heard of Rett syndrome, but it's essentially a syndrome where the child develops normally for a short period of time, and then suddenly you become aware there's something wrong, and the child essentially starts to regress. And there's only one way it ends. It ends with the child's premature death. My friend and his wife know what they're facing. There is no way to avoid it. And we were talking about medical ethics one evening, and he said, if they came up with a method of tweaking the gene, my granddaughter's gene, that would solve that syndrome, I would take it tonight. And I didn't find that to be a challenge to my thesis, because all that's doing is saying, I have a normative understanding of what a human being should be. Should not be someone with Rett syndrome. And tweaking that gene would merely restore what should have been there, but wasn't there. But we know that's not the way gene editing is going to go. Gene editing will go the way of designer babies. We see surgery now being used to, I think, to compensate for what I would think of as psychological issues. The realities of nature subjugated to the ambitions of the will and the desire. Sex. This was the section that my protesters thought I would lead with. I left it to almost the last. But think about how sex has been transformed by technology. Much could be said in this area. Much could be said. I can barely scratch the surface. The most obvious, of course, is that the move from seeing sex as primarily to do with procreation to seeing sex as recreation depends upon access to certain technologies. Very struck by that statement. I cited it this morning in one of the sessions that Professor Favale makes in her, I think, really excellent book, The Genesis of Gender, where she makes the point that the fertility switch has always been, we've always been able to switch it on and off. The difference today is that the default setting is off. That, I think, is a very powerful point. It immediately reduces at least the obvious social implications of sex or the risks of sex. My wife and I were wandering through a town in Pennsylvania last summer and found ourselves in the middle of a rather desultory pro-abortion protest. I think there were about 12 people there. My wife is of a sensitive disposition. She always gets angry when she sees these people. I'm more amoral. I'm kind of looking, is there anything here I can use as an example in a class to teach a point? And sure enough, there was. One of the characters was waving around a banner that said, consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy. Well, that's true today, but 150 years ago was not so true, at least for one of the parties in typical sexual activity. That was not true. And yet that sign makes perfect sense today. I was asked in the class an excellent question on why do I sort of focus on sexual activity in my book when not all human, surely I would concede that not all human activity has moral significance. Absolutely. But I think sex has peculiar significance because it connects to anthropology. How you think about sex connects to how you think about what it means to be a human being. And the example I used to try to draw that out was, and I borrowed this example actually from my friend Francis Beckwith, who's written an excellent paper on this. He wrote a paper on the Harvey Weinstein scandal. And in that paper, he makes the point that if Harvey Weinstein had been selling places in movies to young women for allowing him to stick his finger in their ear, we would probably regard him as a weirdo creep. But we wouldn't regard him as quite the monster we do. And that's an intuition. But intuitively we know that sexual assault operates at a different level to other forms of assault, other forms of bodily penetration. I made the comment, I played rugby at school, not very well. I only played intramural rugby, but I had my head literally kicked in a few times. Got a scar above my eye here. You get your head kicked in on a rugby field and you joke about it an hour or two later. In fact, you're quite proud at an all-boys school to point to the wounds. Shows you become a man kind of thing. Had I been sexually assaulted, I would never have found it very funny, never have made a boast about it, because something more profound would have happened. When we turn sex into recreation or try to con ourselves that it's just recreation, there is a very distinctive anthropological move made there. I'm not sure that I'm yet able to parse it all out, but something significant is going on. I'm very taken with the philosopher Roger Scruton's discussion of sexual assault when he talks about why is sexual assault so heinous? And he says it's because something is taken from you that only you can voluntarily give. What is that thing, he says? It is your very self. Interesting, even think of the, I'm not sure if Scruton uses this example, but think of the language I've used here. I played rugby and I had my head kicked in. I would not typically talk about sexual assault in that way. If I was sexually assaulted, it would not be my head that was kicked in, it would be me that was sexually assaulted. There's an anthropology to sex that I think I'm not able to fully parse at the moment. But the shift to sex as recreation strikes me as profoundly influential on how we think about what it means to be human. And that, of course, means that pornography is even worse than we already know it is. Yes, it objectifies the other, but I would also suggest we know that it kind of dehumanizes the one who watches as well. One of the big moral challenges of the next, I hate to raise such distasteful topics, but it's hard to talk on this without getting distasteful. One of the big moral challenges of the next decade is going to be sex robots. If a husband has sexual relations with a robot, is that adultery? Should it be legitimate to sell sex robots that look like little children? These questions are coming. They're coming. And I think most of us would say, in answer to both questions, well, to the former, yes. To the second, it's wrong. But then we've got to ask ourselves, why? Why? And our current understanding of sex, purely as recreation, where it's okay as long as nobody else gets hurt, is inadequate to enable us to explain why we want to intuitively give those answers. And I would also add that sex is designed to bind us to another particular person in bonds of obligation and dependency. And what does pornography do? Particularly, I think it capitalizes on that unfortunate tendency in male sexual desire for it not always to be tied to a particular person. Sex with a body becomes key rather than sex with a person. I get the students to think about this in class by saying, many of them get married. We're a Christian liberal arts college, so they graduate on the Saturday, they get married on the Monday. It's that kind of deal. And there's always an engaged couple in class, and I'm English, so I like to be cruel and pick on people in class. And they're sort of fresh meat to me. And so I'll call them and say, Sarah, if on the day you get married, you're walking down, your dad's leading you down the aisle towards your spouse, and he turns around, and it's not the guy you're engaged to, it's some other attractive guy that you know, and he's quite pleasant, do you go through with the wedding? Absolutely not. Because your desire is for a particular person. There was a couple of weeks ago, I picked on the guy, and his fiancée was out, and his answer was probably not. To which I said, would you like to reconsider the word probably in that answer? And he was 100% right second time round. But of course, being English and loving to make people suffer, I took great delight in telling his fiancée about his gaffe next time she showed up in class. I shift on sex to sex as recreation. Technologically enabled changes what we understand human beings to mean. Reinforces, I think, that individualism. Sex always carried with it responsibilities. 19th century guy wants to sleep with a girl. What's he got to do? He's got to be clean. He's got to be smart. He's got to have a job. He's got to persuade her and probably her family that he's a safe bet. He's got to marry her. Not anymore. My son was reading something online recently, I think it was in the New York Times, and the person was saying, well, to counter the sexual revolution, we really need to find some way of getting men to commit to their partners. And my son sent it to me, he said, Dad, is this what you used to call marriage? And I said, yeah, something like that. That seemed to be how it was supposed to function. Then finally, and with this point, I will sort of bring the depressing side of the lecture to an end. Don't get too excited. There's not much of a undepressing side to the lecture, but this is the final depressing move. Transhumanism. What I think I missed in the two books is this. Yeah, the transgender movement is definitely part of the LGBTQ movement, socially and politically. Philosophically, I think it's part of transhumanism. First of all, it's not necessarily about sexual desire. You can get men wanting to transition to being women who are still attracted to women. So it's not primarily about sexual desire. I think what it is about is the attenuation of the importance of the body for human identity. That's what I think it's about. And that's where transhumanism kicks in. There's been a long stream, of course, of transhumanist thinking. We had the cyborg feminism of the 70s and 80s, Shulamith Firestone, Donna Haraway. We see that being resurrected at the moment in the works of the Philadelphia-based, I think she's English, feminist, Sophie Lewis. We see it most powerfully, I think, today in the transgender question. Now, the relationship of technology to sex roles has been around since at least the Communist Manifesto, when Marx and Engels make the point that the more industry becomes automated, we would say, the smaller the difference between men and women will become, until I think they actually say the labor of women will supersede that of men. I think that's actually what the manifesto says. I don't think they were envisaging the trans moment. But what they say is on a continuum with the trans moment. The severing of sex from family and reproduction makes sex as identity imaginable. Sex as recreation, imaginable. The advent of transition surgery and hormone treatment, technological developments, make it imaginable that one might transition from being a man to a woman or a woman to a man. One of the things I've noticed in recent years is how many bodily functions, particularly women's bodily functions, are described in problematic terms. Reading Sophie Lewis, gosh, no one, I wouldn't, if I was a woman, I wouldn't want to get pregnant having read Sophie Lewis's description of it. You know, if you read Sophie Lewis, you'd come away thinking, man, this is just going to destroy my body. We see how deep this grips the popular imagination in other documents. I'm not a lawyer, but if you have a chance, you might be interested to check out the Amicus brief in the Dobbs case last year, filed by the professional female athletes of the United States. What's interesting in that brief, I can't parse the legalese. What interested me was the way these female athletes talked about their bodies. They talked about their bodies as if they were not them. They talked about their bodies as I think a carpenter might talk about a saw or a hammer. Or maybe I might talk about a pen or a piece of chalk. They talked about their bodies really as tools of the trade that would allow them to become who they should be, not who they actually were. And I think the internet plays into this as well. The more we socialize in disembodied ways, the more inclined we are to imagine that our bodies are either not important or are actually problems to be overcome. Mary Harrington, in her new book, Feminism Against Progress, makes this statement. It's on page 17, if any of you want to take the reference. When we socialize in disembodied ways online, even as biotech promises total mastery of the bodies we're trying to leave behind, these efforts to abolish sex dimorphism in the name of the human will end up abolishing what makes us human, men and women, leaving something profoundly post-human in its place. In this vision, our bodies cease to be interdependent, sexed, and sentient, and are instead reassembled as a kind of meat Lego. Love that phrase, meat Lego. Kind of distasteful, but very catchy. Meat Lego, built of parts that can be reassembled at will. I think the transgender question is actually a question of the status of the body. And it fits into that bigger philosophical question of transhumanism. It's a convenient partner in the LGBTQ movement to the extent that male, white, heterosexuality remains normative. As I said to students this morning, as white male heterosexuals become less powerful and less significant, we can expect that alliance to start crumbling. Because once the enemy of my enemy is not that strong, then the enemy of my enemy doesn't necessarily need to be my friend. All of these, music, medicine, sex, transhumanism, function as they do because of technology. Ways that empower the individual will, that detach the who question dramatically from the what question. The solution. This is the point I say, hey, I'm a historian. I analyze problems, I never propose solutions, but I'm going to try. I think the solution has to lie in recapturing the what in some ways grounding the who. Now, inevitably, human creativity is an important part of who we are. The who is very important to us as individuals. But we have to find some way of giving an account of the what as delimiting the who. One suggestion, and again, in England we have this phrase, bringing coals to Newcastle. Newcastle is the place where all the coal is exported from. So bringing coals to Newcastle is a pointless exercise. I'm in Notre Dame. One of the things we have to do is reflect upon the importance of our bodies. It's not a surprise to any Catholic here who takes the teaching of the Catholic Church, particularly John Paul II's, St. John Paul II's teaching seriously. We need to find ways of cultivating the belief that we are our bodies. Because if we can do that, then I think the notion that we are dependent and obliged, and here you can hear me channeling Professor Sneed, the notion that we are dependent and obliged will become much easier and more persuasive, much easier to persuade people to believe. And will shape our intuitions. So I've often thought, one of the questions about the abortion debate, it's interesting to me that ultimately the strongest arguments on both sides are not arguments about abstractions. The strongest arguments on both sides are the particular stories that are told. It's very interesting after the Dobbs decision last year that the pro-abortion lobby defaulted very quickly to stories about victims of incest and rape. And we all know that the debate is not really about that. But that proved very powerful. I was a Presbyterian pastor for some years. And I never had this scenario, but I could imagine a situation where a father turns up in my office and tells me that his 13-year-old daughter's been raped and she's pregnant. And I got to tell you that as a pastor, I know the answer I should give to that. She should not have an abortion. But I can't just give that answer. I have to deal with the human tragedy before me. How do I do that? By putting a face to other similar human tragedies and drawing the person to see the rightness of the pro-life argument in that context. I could imagine a scenario in Princeton where Peter Singer and Professor Robert George are both strolling down Nassau Street late one night and hear a baby crying in a doorway and go over to see what's going on. Those of you who know anything about Professor George and Professor Singer will know that they are at opposite ends of the spectrum on the pro-life issue. I bet that if the two of them found a baby crying in a crib on Nassau Street at midnight, there would actually be no disagreement in what they should do. I don't think Professor George would say, we need to call for an ambulance and we need to, start looking for the mother of this child, get her some help. And Peter Singer says, no, it's not a person until it's 2 years old. We can leave it for the feral dogs to eat. I don't think that's how the discussion goes, because it's not an abstraction. That's not an abstraction. Again, one of the things about disembodied human discourse is what? It tilts us towards thinking in abstractions. I quote this interview from Peter Singer in my humanities class at Grove every year. I do a class on Peter Singer's thinking, and then I quote from the interview, perhaps the infamous interview he gave, where the interviewer ends by saying, when your own mother had Alzheimer's disease, you helped care for her. Isn't that a bit inconsistent with your philosophy? And his answer is priceless. His answer is yes, But I guess it's different when it's your own mother. Yeah. She fed you at her breast. She put that sticking plaster on your knee when you fell over in the playground. She was the one to comfort you when you were bullied at school and felt worthless and arrived home and wow, there were mum and dad to help you realize that you weren't a worthless person after all. Mum is not an abstraction. A person with Alzheimer's is an abstraction. So all of this is to say, I think technology is precipitating the problem in anthropology. Professor Deneen on the front row, I know Professor Deneen has spent a lot of time outlining this over the last few years. The kind of problems that Professor Deneen points to in political science and political philosophy, I think they're being cultivated in the popular intuitions via technology. The answer, I would put it this way, because the problem is not an argument, or is not completely an argument, the answer cannot completely be an argument either. The answer has to be how we think about ourselves and how we live in relation to other people. And that's what I missed in my books. That's what I wish that I'd put in. So thank you very much for listening so patiently.
Terrific. Before we move to Q&A, and we have a tradition here in the program of asking our undergraduate students to ask the first questions. Madeline, will you go around? And so if you're an undergraduate student, just raise your hand. I want to welcome and introduce Professor Trueman's wife, Katrina. Thank you for being here with us. Any undergraduates with a question? Should I pause right now and say what we do to the duck?
We could take a poll on that one.
This is at Notre Dame. What we do to the duck is we ask the duck for a donation.
Hi, thank you.
Introduce yourself, Kelly.
Sure. I'm Catalina. I'm a sophomore here.
We met earlier. I remember Catalina. Good to see you again.
I study economics and political science, and I'm a Con Studies minor as well. So to kind of continue on this topic of technology, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the role of social media and of like this individualism taking away from the fact that we're inherently relational beings.
Yeah.
Human beings are born into a family, made to live in community. How is technology working against this? And can we use these technologies for good?
Yeah.
Or are they kind of playing into like allowing us to pretend of the changeability of human nature, like you've mentioned, even with the technologies of transitioning, technologies enabling us to live this inaccurate view of ourselves?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like every question I've had today, it's a really good question to which there is no simple answer. You've heard me say that at least 6 times, I think, today. First of all, I want to say, technology is just there. We can't avoid it. So I don't want to be heard as speaking like a Luddite. I am absolutely delighted that if ever I have to go in for surgery on anything, there are such things as anesthetics and antibiotics around. I do not want to live in the 13th century. I don't even want to live in the 16th century. Taught Reformation for many years, and you say to the students, man, if you struggle with staying awake at night, get hold of a 16th century surgical manual and read it. Those will make you grateful for modern technology, trust me. I'm haunted by a passage. This sounds horribly pretentious, and I don't mean it that way. I'm haunted by a passage in Heidegger. Only pretentious nerds begin sentences with that statement. But Heidegger, in his very important essay, The Question About Technology, he says there's a difference between building a bridge over a river and damming a river up to generate hydroelectric power. And I think what he's getting at is, in the one, nature is kind of respected. Maybe it's subverted a bit, but it's respected. In the second one, technology turns nature into raw material that can simply be turned into something completely different. Go on to social media. Think about social media. Well, my wife and I, we find social media or the internet, we don't do social media, but on the internet, very helpful. We got a new granddaughter. And to us, it's a great delight that we can see little videos of our granddaughter that we wouldn't be able to see typically. We get photos of her regularly. I always know from the cry of delight from the other room that my wife's just got a picture of the granddaughter. She does not cry with delight when I walk through the door late at evening. So there are good things there that I think help. But what's happening in that situation, I would say, is that a bond, a natural bond, and a bond that has been forged in the real world is being strengthened and reinforced by the use of technology. I think when we move into a realm where the bonds are forged in the realm of technology, and where technology governs the nature of those bonds, something dangerous is going on. And I used the example in class this morning. If you remember, we talked about high levels of anxiety. You know, when I was at school, I had 4 or 5 pals. I was talking to you earlier on. Knew they were the only ones whose approval I needed. Today, online in this disembodied world, you can have hundreds of friends, and they can talk trash about you very, very cheaply, but it still has an impact. I don't care about Twitter, but even when I see negative tweets about me, when somebody sends one to me, it still hurts a little bit, and I don't care. If you live in this world, I can only imagine how devastating that must be. So I would say to those who are deeply embedded in social media, think about, are your relationships rooted in social media, or are they fortified and strengthened by social media, but rooted in something else? And I think that's what you need to aim for. Your real friends are the people who sit next to you in the lecture theatre. Your real friends are the ones you go to the bar with of an evening. I can say can't say that when I teach at Southern Baptist institutions. I can say that at Notre Dame because you're all Irish. You know what I mean. Your real friends are the ones who, and I think COVID in some ways perversely helped us get a little handle on this. Grove City, we only went online for 8 weeks when nobody quite knew what was happening in the spring of March 2020. We were back in the fall. Students had to wear masks for a year. When I asked the students, hey, did you like being taught online? No. Did you like wearing masks? No. Why not? Because bodies are important, because faces are important. These things are not cost-free when we move away from them. So I would say work hard on prioritizing those relationships that are rooted in the real world and are matters of real relation. And I spoke this morning, I'm giving a lecture on Providence on Saturday. I think the loss of the notion of friendship, true friendship in modern culture is tragic. That friendship has become technologized. That's disastrous.
Okay. Any other undergraduates? Okay, there's 2 questions right here. And if you could stand up and introduce yourself so we can also.
Hi, I'm Ben Jaquel, just a visitor. You mentioned kind of the disembodiment of the concept of the self from the body through various forms of technology and such. With secularism and just kind of commitment to materialism, what justifies even any kind of a concept of self apart from the material body? Yeah,
it's interesting because I have some of the pushback I've had is, isn't Christianity responsible for this with its body-soul distinction? To which my response has always been, well, not Christianity properly taught. Thomas Aquinas is very clear that it's not until the day of resurrection that it's fully and truly you in the presence of God. But secularism, as it moves to its materialist mode, depends how you understand the matter. And I think, yes, we're materialists, but we tend to default to thinking of the body as a lump of matter attached to a will somehow, and that real me is the will, and that body is kind of cosmic Play-Doh that can be manipulated to bring into conformity with my will and desire. Now, whether that is coherent materialism, that's for a philosopher to parse, not a historian, but that seems to me to be the situation we are currently in. Does that make sense?
They're just committed to the concept of the will.
Yeah.
Just a priori. They're holding
it seems to me, it's sort of tangentially related. Some years ago, I was in London and decided to do something I'd never done before, visit the grave of Karl Marx in Highgate Cemetery. It's quite an impressive grave, actually. And as I stood at the grave, I was fascinated to look at who was buried round about him. Round about him were buried leaders of various communist movements from around the world. I guess that's testimony to Britain's willingness to take in terrorists from all over the world and grant them safe haven. But it also struck me that these materialists want to be buried by Karl Marx. How weird is that? Why do they even want to be buried in a graveyard at all? And that made me, maybe there's something intrinsic in it. You can be as materialist as you want, but somehow you're aware there's some spooky animated principle there that is attached to this matter.
Question right here.
Hi, Dr. Trueman. I'm Jack Young, grad student here at Notre Dame.
Good to meet you, Jackie.
Yeah, and thank you for your talk today and also the books that led to this discussion. So I'm a historian, but I don't really work on the same questions that you work on. What I've found your work most thought-provoking and pot-stirring is how you get to the questions of anthropology. And I think kind of by implication and extension, your kind of genealogy and critique of contemporary kind of pop anthropology is also a critique of kind of modern humanities academia and the kind of crisis of competence, the destabilization of what it means to be human, and the kind of malaise that feels like history, literature, philosophy, and others are kind of at this point. So I guess my question is on the level of just classroom and also on the level of kind of scholarship and kind of engaging with kind of our larger fields of study. Are there paths forward kind of in this moment, and how maybe does your project inform what those paths forward look like for kind of individual scholars?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think from what I can tell, the field is very bleak for scholars in the humanities at the moment who hold to any kind of traditional anthropology. We have students transferring into Grove every year from elite schools elsewhere who are studying literature, but they wanted to study literature. They didn't want to do identity politics under the umbrella of doing English literature or French literature or something like that. So my anecdotal observation is things are very bleak. Where does the future lie? I think the future may lie with small liberal arts schools that can focus upon the things that really matter. Now, don't get me wrong, I did the reference to my doctoral program was written by my history supervisor at the University of Cambridge, who was a card-carrying Marxist, very into critical theory. And it's not that these theories don't have useful things to say, but I think they have so overwhelmed much of what's going on in the humanities that other big questions have been ruled out of bounds. And maybe the future lies in small liberal arts colleges where the big questions can still be asked. And I strive to try to keep Grove as one of those, I suppose. It was certainly one of the things that attracted me to go and teach at Grove. But the way forward, that's hard, because I also think that I was an administrator myself for some years, and I know how administrators think. And one of the disadvantages you have at a big school is that the humanities don't generate research income, which means, there's a lot of talk about woke administrators and weak administrations. Another way of looking at administrations of big schools is they have no incentive to fight for the humanities because there's no money attached to them. And I think that that's not necessarily a more charitable take on them, but it's a different take. And I think in a world which doesn't value the humanities are vulnerable to broader politics, because what school wants to lose NCAA qualifications when you've got a massive stadium like that out there over what's going on in the religion department or the English department? It would be a brave administration to make that choice. So I think the whole model of big higher education also makes the humanities vulnerable as well. It's a very impressive stadium, by the way. Goodness gracious. Dr. Munoz took me up top this morning, and it's breathtaking.
Yeah, that was a terrific answer. Just Debbie will edit out. We'll put the Center for Constitutional Government in Grove City College for the video. Yeah, Professor Danina's.
Thanks so much, Carl. That was a wonderful talk, and I'm always happy if there's someone in the room who's more depressing than I am. So I really appreciate your welcome back anytime. I want to explore. I think it's really, it's absolutely incontrovertible, this changing perception of our anthropology because of these technological trends. But I want to kind of explore what you see as the kind of causal mechanism.
Yeah.
And I don't think you really either make that clear, or maybe it's something that we can't quite make clear. But one way of the way in which I think what seemed to be implied or underlying the way that you presented it is that the technology in some ways has a kind of almost inherent trajectory. And that trajectory is to make us more and more disembodied, individualistic, abstract, which if this is at least along the lines of what you're suggesting, would suggest in some ways that our genuine anthropology actually is tending in this direction as well. In other words, that we are, in our nature, we're more Hobbesian than Aristotelian, perhaps. We're more these creatures who want to be autonomous, individuated selves. This is our nature. But you also give us counterexamples in which technology also exists that draws us together. There's lots of examples then and now. Small liberal arts colleges, that's a great technology bringing people together. The constitutional studies program is a great technology. I love front porches. Front porch is a great technology for bringing people together. We can think of lots of these town squares, small coffee shops and so forth. Well, I know people sit around in their laptops in coffee shops now. So, but this would suggest then that there's an opposing form of technology, that if our primary value is communal and to reinforce friendship and connections, we could have a society, indeed we can demonstrate societies that have had that technological form. So I guess at the risk of, or to prevent us perhaps from kind of going down a deterministic technological direction, ought we at least to entertain the possibility that it's not the technology that makes us into the genuine creatures that we are, but rather deeper presuppositions of the kind of creatures that we are lead us or tend us to select the technology or to develop the technology that makes us or realizes that aspect of us. So in other words, I guess I'm wondering how independent the technology is that you're describing from the deeper anthropological assumptions that we in some ways have to inform the technologies that we adopt and how we use them.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And at this point, I sort of switch into theologian mode. And as a Christian, I'd want to say, the essence of the fall is what? It's that striving for autonomy. And therefore, when you give somebody technology, they're going to use it to tilt towards further independence. So I give a theological answer on that level. To give sort of hope, I would say, in fact, I love the way you framed your question, because it seems to me that what you're pointing to there is we need to be more intentional. We need to be more self-conscious about the way technology shapes how we think about the world. And in doing so, we might be able to be more intentional about using it rather than being used by it. Small example, a few months ago, I suddenly realized I'd chosen my seat at the airport so that I could recharge my cell phone. Raises the immediate question, am I now a cyborg? Cyborgs are not necessarily fusions of robot and human. They just humans who shape their lives around technology. And I've sort of tried to resolve since then, no, I'm going to choose my seat based on other categories than that. So maybe intentionality is key here. And I like what you said about front porches. I would say the same about dining rooms. I remember reading a few years ago a report saying that many modern houses are built without dining rooms today. And that struck me. That's an interesting technological development, because that which used to bring the family together is no longer going to be there in the typical American house. So, using technology intentionally to promote community rather than dissipate it might be the way forward.
Good. I'd just say that's one of the reasons we always try to have meals before our events, so people can gather.
Yeah, I'd not mentioned that. That is a lovely idea.
One last question here by Evie. Oh, we have two. Let's go here and then we'll come to Evie, but we'll keep our answers short, okay?
Hi, I'm George. I graduated from Notre Dame. It'll be 57 years ago in a month or so. And there's a phrase I hear on radio and television quite frequently, and it's almost Orwellian, it seems. The phrase is gender affirming care.
Yeah.
And it's natural if a young woman, 14, she's a year or two into becoming a woman, has distress, that the phrase should mean affirming that she is indeed a female, and that she should be provided with materials about other women who have struggled and successfully gone through it, and how they deal with the unwanted gaze of men of all ages, which happens in the distress. But the phrase is constantly used only in the other sense of the phrase, and that seems that we maybe should push back and try and recapture that phrase.
Yeah, there's a very significant linguistic battle going on at the moment. I mean, as soon as you concede the ground of gender-affirming care, it becomes very rhetorically difficult to oppose it, because that's a positive thing and it's accepting a certain reality. So I think you're pointing at something very important. And if you haven't read it, there was I think a very important essay published, I think it was yesterday or the day before, in the online magazine Unheard, written by the English analytic philosopher Kathleen Stock, who's actually a lesbian. She's not got any skin in the traditional conservative game, but she is making the argument there that the trans movement is very much rooted in the hijacking and transformation of language. So I think the point you're raising is very, very significant. And that's why battles over pronouns, for example, they're not just battles over pronouns. They're actually battles over a view of reality. And we need to be very careful that when we meet the other side halfway on a linguistic point, we are not actually conceding the very ground that we're trying to contest.
Evie?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Evie Bailey. I'm a grad student here.
I know who you are.
Yeah.
Good to see you again.
I finally read that book you gave me. Anyway, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about how these technologies and this moment kind of maps onto or might increase class divides in society. Because I was thinking about like when you raised the plastic surgery point.
Yeah.
Like I was recently around people for the first time who were just talking about receiving these surgeries, and all of them worked in finance in a big city, and it's just. This is not something that you encounter, I think, as much outside of those very upper echelon circles. But I wonder if it might strengthen class divides that we have these technologies and use them.
Yeah, I think if we want to use the language of class struggle, what is emerging is a new class struggle. It's not the old class struggle relative to means of production. What is emerging, I think, is a class struggle relative to forms of information. I'm not sure if it's Mary Harrington who uses this language, but she uses language. I've seen language used of the laptop class. And, the laptop class is probably pretty much everybody in this room. I self-evidently, you can tell from my accent, I'm not from South Bend. I'm from the West Country of England. I can pretty much work anywhere because I trade in ideas, I trade in words, and that's all mediated generally through technology. I live in Western Pennsylvania. We own a house really in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by farmland. I live among those who are very much tied to a place. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is an emerging struggle between those who can work anywhere and those who can only work here or in this place. And that probably plays over as well into, that shapes how you think about your own body. If I can work anywhere, then I seem to be sovereign over all things. If I can only work here, then does that not shape how I think about reality? If I'm a farmer, I'm tied to the seasons in a way that I am not tied to the seasons. So nature has an authority for me if I'm tied to place and soil that it does not have for me if I work via technology. So I think you're onto something very, very important there. And I think that's where around the world where we're seeing popular uprisings, whether it's the Yellow Jackets in France or whether it's things that happen in the United States, it's not your grandfather's class struggle. It's a new class struggle that's emerging, I think.
Before we thank Professor Trueman, 3 invitations. First of all, if for those online or those who are not on our mailing list, if you contact me or Professor O'Malley or Soren Greffenstadt, who's outside, get on our mailing list and our email list, and we can tell you about our upcoming events. Secondly, an invitation to join us next Wednesday, a week from Wednesday, Harvey Mansfield, this room, again, lunch at 12, and then the lecture at 12:30 on Tocqueville. And thirdly, the bookstore is here with copies of Professor Trueman's latest book. I'm sure you'll sign them.
If you want me to, yes.
If you buy one, he'll sign it. If you buy 2, he'll give you a hug.
Well, I don't know about that. Just buy the one copy. That's my advice.
Please join
to avoid
me
disappointment.
in thanking Professor Trueman.